king of podcasts, proudly presents The Broadcasters Podcast. A weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Here is the king of podcasts.
Welcome to the Broadcasters Podcast, episode 145. Thank you for being here. So glad to have you. As you listen to the program, here's what I got for all of you right now. First of all, I will be pushing back my interview with Muinza Kassiri, which I had planned to go and run the next two parts of the interview over the next 2 weeks. I'm going to push it back by 1 week because of a little bit of time constraints with an interview I got to conduct this week. And it is courtesy of the Miami Book Fair International, the 38th annual Miami Book Fair, which is the largest book fair in the country. And through the full-time commitments that I have through WMR.FM and CannabisRadio.com, I went ahead and took it upon myself to take one of the interviews because it was one offered to me that was in the areas of music, movies, TV, and radio. And I think I got a really good guest. Had a great conversation with Grace Elizabeth Hale. She is the Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia and the author of the new book, Cool Town, How Athens, Georgia Launched Alternative Music and Changed American Culture. So I'm going to give you an interview that I did with her, which was about 37 minutes long. I will put that at the end of the program. So we're not going to go too long so I can keep the show within an hour, my normal format. And again, apologies for holding off the show for 1 day because I went ahead and decided to watch, like everybody else, the presidential debate. I wanted to see what was going on there. And because of how long it went, I wanted to make sure that I had time to do the show tonight. So it was one of those few things I did. That's what I did a few weeks ago. It's just staying consistent. So anyway, one of the big stories that comes up today here on the program is Quibi. You might remember the names that came behind this, okay? In a matter of 10 basically months that it was around, it's going away. It was a mobile-first streaming service for short-form video packed with stars. And now, one of the stories we have here really says everything. We're going to go to CNET for the story to give us the real start of what this is. It was yet a new streaming service vying for your money. At the same time, we have Peacock or Disney Plus. And then the increases of the audience coming in at a time when on-demand was getting very popular for Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple TV, and others. Almost $2 billion invested into this format in ultra-expensive star-studded shows, all of which came in episodic nuggets shorter than 10 minutes and were designed to be watched on your phone. In less than 7 months, it failed. CNET just says it like that. One of the shows you might remember was Chrissy's Court, the wife of singer John Legend, doing the Judge Judy type show, a courtroom reality show called Chrissy's Court. That was one of the shows. You had others, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But anyway, Quibi is going to be shutting down. It will go dark or on around December 1st. Quibi launched April 6th, rolled out a mobile-only concept just a couple of weeks after the pandemic locked down large swaths of North America, trapping them in their homes. People could watch in their homes on their phones, but Quibi's bet was exclusively mobile short-form video, premised on people gobbling up these quick-bite episodes while out and about. It launched without any support to watch Quibi's programming on TVs. The company scrambled as users complained about not being able to watch its shows on big screens in their house. It also launched without simple, easy ways to share or meme its shows on social media, stunting virality and word of mouth. It also ramped up in the middle of a new wave of streaming services. Tech and media giants all rushed to shape the future of video. So you're going up with subscription dollars against the likes of Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, Peacock, and HBO Max. Let's not forget about them. And established players like Netflix and Hulu and the others. And also, You have $5 a month Quibi. It was a $5 a month subscription. You were going up against YouTube, the pioneer of free short-form video that draws in more than 2 billion viewers every month. So they thought the celebrities were so appealing and so viable, that was enough to get them to spend $5 a month. Well, we now see how important celebrities are. Celebrities are a dying breed. There's still a need for actors and actresses, but to become celebrities is a different story. So for actors and actresses to become famous, maybe we don't necessarily need them to be famous. We just need them to be talented. So this unconventional strategy, a corporate strategy, by the way, from the man that brought us DreamWorks and worked during the heyday of Walt Disney Studios. Corporate, in every sense of the word. And Meg Whitman. Corporate, business executive. Board member of Procter & Gamble and Dropbox. Former president and CEO of Hewlett-Packard. Corporate, all together, celebrities, corporate owned and controlled. You had not just Chrissy Teigen, you also had in their programming, and also that were going to work on their programming, LeBron James, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Reese Witherspoon, Chance the Rapper, Kevin Hart, Jennifer Lopez, Idris Elba, Zac Efron, Tina Fey, Liam Hemsworth, Joe Jonas and Sophie Turner, and also filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro, Antoine Fuqua, Catherine Hardwicke, and Ridley Scott were all making series on this particular service for the sake of the particular service. $2 billion in investments. Couldn't that money been used somewhere else better? Also, Meg Whitman was also a former chief of eBay. She said that before the launch, that Quibi was willing to change if need be. It struggled to sign up people at the pace it had hoped. Some of those changes became reality. They would try some efforts to recover this, widening its device support beyond mobile. It added support for Apple's AirPlay in May to stream its programming on some TV screens. Updated Android and iOS apps to cast to Google's Chromecast and Chromecast integrated TVs. October added support for TV streaming devices proper, releasing apps for Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, and Android TV. But that was just too late. They also then added the ability to screenshot its shows in July, allowing viewers to easily share and meme its programming. Jeffrey Katzenberg, the founder of Quibi, was the head of Disney's movie division from 1984 to 1994. Co-founded DreamWorks Animation. They blamed the coronavirus, which affected people's viewing habits, which would be neutral to Quibi. And the pandemic was basically, quote, everything that has gone wrong, quote. In the end, now they've decided to go ahead and shut it down, and that the concept may have been flawed. $2 billion concept was flawed. Whitman and Katzenberg wrote a joint open letter, quote, likely for one of two reasons, because the idea itself wasn't strong enough to justify a standalone streaming service, or because of our timing. Whitman and Katzenberg said in a joint open letter, unfortunately, we will never know, but we suspect it's between a combination of the two. All that is left now is to offer a profound apology for disappointing you and ultimately for letting you down. So 2020, Quibi will be a footnote in the history of this tumultuous year that we've had. And all I'm saying as well is you look at the issues that came across with this service. It's not so much that the service was bad. It was. I never got onto it. I never was interested in buying or subscribing to it. But I followed along. I reported on this throughout this program. Month after month, after certain things we were making changes to, I reported on when I'm not podcasting. I talked about it. And my thing more than anything else was, it was shit. No one was going to buy this. It doesn't matter if the pandemic was here or was not. What was more important is the real reason why this did not do well is because the celebrities don't have the star power, or not so much the star power. The star power can be generated by whatever machine there is in Hollywood. But the Hollywood luster of stars doesn't have what it takes. $2 billion. Why couldn't you put that into movies? Why didn't Quibi do something more and create the movies? Why don't you take the products, create the movies? This idea of short form was dead on arrival. I felt like that from the beginning. But again, who am I? What am I going to say about this? I might as well step back and see what's going on. So I did. And I didn't, I just kept my mouth shut. But the truth is, I already felt like this was just a corporate cash grab. You put the celebrities out there, you have to put up so much money for these stars to do this content. And you thought you could just piecemeal this and get people out there to go ahead and buy in. So all the industry rags are talking about it. So that was CNET. What did the industry say? Hollywood Reporter. He gets on Wednesday afternoon, Jeffrey Katzenberg, along with CEO Meg Whitman, suit and tie in an emotional video conference with the staff of Quibi in his home in Bel Air. So all those people out of a job. Many Hollywood observers have been predicting Quibi's demise since the moment Katzenberg first laid plans for the ambitious startup known. I was one. Not a Hollywood observer. Well, I'm a Hollywood observer, so yes, I would be that. But that didn't make the news any less surprising to the employees who had been in the trenches with him for the last 2 years. 2 years they were building this. Many of whom are fiercely loyal to the mogul and devoted to the business they helped to build. 250 Quibi employees will find themselves looking for new jobs at a moment of uncertainty in the industry as several major studios reorganize and act their own layoffs. What they are likely to find are opportunities that look starkly different than the ones they had at Quibi. So Hollywood's changing a lot. And by the way, Katzenberg, to his credit, he was able to get a number of people to leave established jobs in some pretty big companies. Netflix, Lionsgate, NBC Universal, Turner and Snapchat. You had a number of high-profile executives also lured away for Quibi. CAA's Jim Toth, Viacom's Doug Herzog, former Hollywood Reporter, Billboard Media Group co-president, and Chief Creative Officer Janice Min. Hollywood Reporter writes, Quibi was always going to be a gamble. They wanted to reinvent how people consume entertainment programming, asking them to pay as much as $8 a month for access to short, serialized stories that they could view on their phones. And a source with knowledge of Quibi says people were willing to take a chance on the startup, which at that point had raised $1 billion in funding and counted every major studio in town as an investor in exchange for the opportunity to get on the ground floor of a new type of Hollywood firm. I mean, how do you mess up such a plan for a digital project? That kind of money. Again, this was just brought in because of the people put into it. So it's just the aesthetics that brought people to this project. But again, a corporate sense, we'll just put these big names in here and this big name talent into it and take a horrible concept and a bad platform and a bad business plan and fail miserably. They did. They made more than 100 shows, which I hope they just sell them off to make some money back to their investors. It earned a reputation as a creative playground for its young executives, who would likely be several levels removed from the decision-making process inside a more traditional TV or network studio. But that's not the point. The executives still had some clout. That didn't make a difference. What about the talent? Nobody had a chance to be new talent to come on here. There was a ceiling for the talent that had to come in. They had to be established stars. They had to be celebrities. And the people that came in of this 250 employees, they're all people that are just recruited away. But they weren't on the way up. They were already up somewhere. Because Katzenberg and Whitman, to their credit, yes, they picked the cream of the crop in Hollywood. They did what they had to do to get the cream of the crop to get who they wanted to bring on. Got it. Quibi rank and file were caught off guard by the Wednesday news that the company would be shutting down. Some of them learned via reports in the Wall Street Journal and The Information. The sources with ties to Quibi note. Quibi has money in the bank, and the assumption was that it would find a way to continue operating as it tried to enact a turnaround. Despite initial disappointment, employees have generally accepted that it's time for the company to call it quits. In a CNBC interview, Whitman confirmed that Quibi had cash left to spend, but called pulling the plug on the business and returning money to shareholders, the honorable thing to do. And that Quibi will be able to pay employee severance as they enter an uncertain job market. One person with ties to Quibi said, quote, entertainment is not an industry you choose because it's easy. There's no straight line to success. You have to take risks. How much of a risk was it really when you put somebody out there and said, oh, okay, well, we'll just go ahead and, bring along someone we'll just bring all this bona fide talent, bona fide everything, all this corporate studio infrastructure and bring it in. Like you brought in the infrastructure to make people feel like, oh, okay, then it's going to be all right. There's not going to be any problem with Quibi because, oh, this is not just some startup. No, it's like a new network with all this stuff going on with just a cool, quirky concept that was easy to go and sell to certain investors, especially when you have somebody with a pedigree of Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman. It's a slap in the face to those who were in Hollywood or in the business or trying to find their way in the business. It's a slap in the face. This is what's against my issue of creative fighting against corporate and the opportunities that came. Really, how much diversity, equity, and inclusion were included in an outfit like that with so much money involved? Any question? These guys are able to get the investment money. They can get the institutional investors. So what kind of risks did they really take? And again, they might have spent some money, but they're going to get some of the money back because you know what? Even the investors, they're going to say, no, you're not going to run this to the ground. Plus the reputation for Katzenberg, Whitman, and everybody else involved with the project. Well, he said, well, we're just going to stop this thing before it bleeds. Okay. So that's what they did. They saved their ass in Hollywood. They saved their reputation by doing what they did. But what they did was they sacrificed all the employees they brought and recruited on board like scumbags. And they also basically just put a slap in the face to all the talent they brought on board. Because now all those people on the resume, they're going to have Quibi on their resume. A failure of a project. And all these people are going to be attached to it. And this is a stain on Hollywood itself. And the corporate masses. This is what corporate can do. They can fail. And they can come up with a mishmash, half-ass idea, and they can absolutely fail. Corporate trying to work into something in the digital of which they do not know of. And they did. That's what they get. This is on them. What a mistake. Anyways. I'll leave it there. I don't want to bring up more about it. It's okay. A couple of things I want to bring up before I go into my interview with Grace Elizabeth Hale about the book Cool Town, How Athens, Georgia launched alternative music and changed American culture. So, iHeartMedia. My program is exclusively was distributed by Spreaker, which is owned by Voxnest. Well, I thought I was away from iHeartMedia and Clear Channel and all that stuff 15 years ago, but nope, they're back. They're back in my life. iHeartMedia has acquired the podcast technology company Voxnest. So that means this program and all my other programming has some attachment to iHeartMedia. Bob Pittman is now in my shit. That's what's happening now. Voxnest was launched January 2018 following the merger of Spreaker and Blog Talk Radio, led by co-founder and president Francesco Bashiri. Prior to the acquisition, iHeartMedia already had a minority stake. So now, through Voxnest, they will be able to provide podcast advertisers with, quote, additional targetable inventory at scale by allowing monetization across an entire range of podcast inventory on Voxnest's platform. The inventory will increase the monetization of its full range of podcasts and advance the marketplace for both buyers and sellers. Because, yeah, they got a good ad set up. You hear the ads on this program, which I'm grateful because they do help out this show and I get to monetize it. So that's a great thing. And I'll ask you guys for the money. Just a little bit of ads just to help out for the support. And then iHeart's going to supposedly drive greater monetization for creators of podcast content wherever they currently publish their shows, connecting Voxnest's advanced ad technology with multiple publishing platforms across the industry. Bob Pittman, chairman and CEO of iHeartMedia, said, quote, this is an important addition to the iHeart digital product ecosystem. The addition of iHeart's offerings to Voxnest will ensure critical mass for the platform and accelerate its growth. It's not going to make much of a difference. Listen, iHeartMedia being attached to it, and the iHeartMedia part, sure. But I don't see much else to it. Just saying. Francisco Bashiri originally created Spreaker and now is CEO of Voxnest. He said that with this combination, for the first time, there will be one podcast technology platform that can bring together all of the demand sources with the largest supplier of podcast inventory, creating the only podcast technology platform that consolidates all the podcast markets into one, making buying more efficient for buyers and sellers of podcast advertising, and creating a unique benefit for the 10,000+ podcast publishers that are part of the Voxnest network today, of which I am one. Thank you very much. I'm going to keep my eye out and see what's going on. See what comes of all this right here. I'm going to wait and see if it really helps out. And listen, if there's really some significant benefit to people like me and to my fellow podcast brethren that are on this platform, hey, I will eat my words. I'd like to do that. I did work for them at one point. I'd like to hope that they will be able to do things right by all this. So let's see what they're able to do. I'd like to find out for myself. The corporate issues that people are having. There was a story the Hollywood Reporter put out regarding Disney and ESPN. When Disney bought ESPN, man, the ESPN was still doing something pretty well. So at the moment, it was once Disney's cash cow. It's now shedding linear subscribers, and the high cost of live sports rights are hindering transition to a direct-to-consumer future. Direct-to-consumer. At one point, it used to make $10 billion a year. Now it's caught between two business models, the direct-to-consumer future and the pay TV past. In 2010, ESPN had 100 million pay TV subscribers. Now it's down to 83 million in 2019. So close to a 20% drop in a decade. Disney has declined to take its flagship ESPN network direct to consumer. We believe due to the high wholesale payment rate the company receives from distributors and concern that consumer demand may underwhelm at an unnecessary retail rate. ESPN is not sitting on its laurels. The company has announced a significant expansion of ESPN Plus and premium written content and audio content. There will be new content of simulcast and telecast of daily ESPN radio shows from the likes of Dan Le Batard and Max Kellerman, among others. And more than 20 writers will see their work shift from ESPN Plus with a heavy emphasis on analysis and insight-driven reporting. Breaking news and investigative stories will still remain free on ESPN.com. And ESPN's core business will still be live sports television with multiple cable channels and some broadcast programming making up the bulk of its content budget. So they're worried. And to just hear that stat right there alone, to see that it's already gone down so much, is very scary for them. Just at least to say that. And that's all I'm going to say about that right now. I'm going to leave it there. Time for me to go ahead and move along to my featured interview. Once again, my featured interview for this episode is with Grace Elizabeth Hale. A great conversation about Athens, Georgia, and the music scene that came from it. You remember the likes of Widespread Panic, REM, B-52s, and others? Well, we get to go and talk all about Athens, Georgia, and how it became such a prominent place for music and how important it was to the fabric of music altogether in the late 70s, early 80s. We go through a lot of it. So it's a very interesting conversation, something different than would be from this program, but I thought it was really fascinating. I hope you guys will definitely check out her book, and you will enjoy this conversation I have with Grace Elizabeth Hale here on the Broadcasters Podcast. Enjoy. So my next guest, I want to go ahead and thank first and foremost our good friends at the Miami Book Fair International. We've been working with them for feels like almost nearly a decade, but they've been so wonderful to us. Again, they're going to be holding their annual event this year, yet it will be virtual. It will be online. The website is miamibookfaironline.com, and the event will be held virtually November 15th through the 22nd. So my next guest is the Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia. Her previous books include A Nation of Outsiders, How the White Middle Class Fell in Love with Rebellion in Post-War America, and Making Whiteness, the Culture Segregation in the South from 1890 to 1940. Now, here's a different twist. The new book she has just put out, entitled this year, is called Cool Town: How Athens, Georgia launched alternative music and changed American culture. And she will be featuring her book at the 38th Annual Miami Book Fair International. Grace Elizabeth Hale joins me. Thanks for being with us, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. What a fascinating chance to go and read about this. And the thing is, compared to some of the previous titles we just mentioned, there is a different story about this book because of the fact that you lived it. You were part of this, so it's really almost you can feel like it's a bit of autobiographical because of all the personal things you could tell. Now, I did not get a chance to read the book. I did get to look at part of what was out there to go and take a look at and what a lot of people have said about it. So to put context to why you would be such a good person to write about Athens, Georgia, and the music scene that was there at the time, from the late 70s, early 80s, and continues on today, I must add. You were there in the 80s. You knew the players. You moved there in 1982 to attend University of Georgia, go Bulldogs. You enrolled as a business student, and then 5 years in Athens, you then co-founded the Downstairs Cafe, coffee shop, and music club with David Levitt, and you would then join him, and together you had a band called Cordy Lawn that you had together. So you were part of this. You had these certain acts that were brought on to this part. You were in the middle of, just like if you think of, what's the street in Nashville? Beale Street, I think it is. Or just think of, just the idea you were in the center of it all. So talk to me about just, where you were able to go and pull the information from, what happened as part of what you were part as a nucleus of what was Athens, Georgia.
Yeah, that is a lot of the reason that I wrote this book. But to be honest with you, initially it was a barrier because I kept hoping somebody else would write this book. I thought, as somebody who had been a participant, I will say not a starring role. I'm more of one of the members of the chorus, you might say, or the actors whose names would be farther down the screen.
Right.
But as a participant, as part of the sort of circle of what was happening, I kept hoping that some other serious music critic or music historian would write this book, but it didn't happen. And after a friend and really an absolutely brilliantly talented singer-songwriter, Vic Chestnut, who was from Athens, died in 2009, it made me realize that somebody needed to get started interviewing these people, that they wouldn't always be around. And so the book is a little bit memoir. It's mostly history and music criticism. It's not an academic book. It's written for people who love indie alternative music, but there is a little little bit of memoir in the story. That really helped me in some ways, though, because when I got started, I at least knew some people to begin to contact. They, of course, would put me in touch with other people. I did almost 100 interviews for this book.
Wow.
But having that sort of experience in the town gave me a starting point. I did learn a lot of things that I didn't know about. So it is not just the story of what I knew or participated in.
Oh, absolutely. No, I know you definitely went much farther out of that spectrum. But the one thing is that with this, I would imagine like the run-of-the-mill Rolling Stone, NME, Spin Magazine columnists, they're not looking to go and make the trip to Athens, Georgia. And I guess for yourself, I'd also imagine that if you were interviewed for a said book, if somebody would have taken the initiative like you're saying and done it, you probably would have, I wouldn't have doubted it would have triggered you to go ahead and say, you know what, I know all that's going on here. I can do this book too. I might have to just put up my own copy and put my own recollection and what I can gather of it as an author. I can imagine that also could come in play too.
Yeah, it's a really humbling process, frankly, to try to think back on your life. All of us are really bad at remembering our life stories, and we often screw these things up when we recollect them. What we remember are the stories, the moments, the feelings. We're bad at timelines and actual dates, and maybe it was not that club, but another club where I saw that band. So I have to say that interviewing so many people, I had a real sense of humility, even in approaching my own memories, to make sure that I checked them as much as I could against other sources, because all of us do that.
It was just an interesting time. I'm in Florida, so it is something to be said about how Georgia was always depicted, and to see the kind of rock scene would come from this, or not just so much rock. I mean, it was the influences of so much other music that was just guitar, drum, bass driven. The idea of just where I just listened to something on YouTube. There was a station that actually was just putting out the kind of music that chronicled the first 5 years of Athens, from 78 to 83. Everything from, it had some that had ska influence, or it had a folk influence, or a very alternative rock, almost a bit of a new wave influence. So it was definitely something that was just, it was a bit of an experimental, definitely very in direction where you're just feeling just a flavor that's just so different and so raw and so creative. And it wasn't something that you would find in New York City or London or, in Los Angeles. It was just a different sound. I want to profile what Georgia Public Radio said about the book. So they said like this: Athens, Georgia was a sleepy southern college town in the late 1970s and early 80s. Georgia Bulldogs football and established fraternity and sorority scene dominated social life on the campus, but something was percolating on the shadows of Millage Avenue, a creative underground as vibrant and as subversive as any you might find in the country's major cities. It was in this period that Athens became the site of one of the most influential regional music scenes of the late 20th century, spawning groundbreaking bands like the B-52's Widespread Panic, Pylon, REM, most notably, and others, much like what San Francisco was in the late 60s, Grace, and Seattle was in the early 90s. In the intro of the book, you wrote, quote, "In Athens, Georgia in the 1980s, if you were young and willing to live without much money, anything seemed possible. Magic sparkled like sweat on the skin of dancers at a party or club. Promise winked underfoot like the bits of broken glass embedded in the downtown sidewalks. A new world seemed to be emerging out of our creativity, our music, our art, and our politics, but also the way we understood ourselves and related to each other." Love the way you depicted that. So the inspirations and influences. Talk to me about what did foster this new organic scene. And you did come into this a few years into the middle of this. What were you seeing? What was it that really created all this? That really just, you were catching it right as it's starting to make its really make an evolution.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a few key structural issues. It's an isolated place. It's a very inexpensive place at the time, and there is a large public university there. Now that university, my own alma mater, has pretensions of elite grandeur, but let me just say it didn't then. It was easy to get into. It was cheap to go to. And I see those as strengths, not as weaknesses. So it had a wide variety of students from all over the state mostly, but neighboring states as well. And most importantly, all the resources of that public university, which were available then to the public. You didn't even have to be a student. You could use the library. You could look at the old magazines. You could listen to the old musical recordings and watch important old films in the film library. All of those resources we now take for granted on the web, they were there in the library. So those key factors were there. But at the same time, you had those factors in other places, other college towns, small town college towns across the country. So it's important, I think, to think about a few key individuals. And there, I think it's really important to note the influence of the gay and queer community in Athens. I had grown up around, particularly around the art school, but not entirely. Pretty closeted community, not entirely in the sort of post-World War II era, but that community nurtured a few key individuals like Jeremy Ayres and much more famous individuals like Ricky Wilson and Keith Strickland, who are key members of the B-52s. And those early key figures really played a role, particularly Jeremy Ayres, who moved off to New York City, became a part of the drag queen burlesque kind of scene there in the late 60s and 70s, got in with Andy Warhol's Factory during the period when Warhol was interested in the drag queens, became a minor Warhol drag queen named Silva Thin, and brought that kind of spirit of creative communal activity back to Athens.
Not too long ago, I read the book FM, which was penned by Richard Neer, about really just the change of what you were hearing with music going on in terms of just the rock guitar based sound that was just changing and evolving so much. So, there might have been a point, obviously, if people were identifying with the South, you're definitely thinking of Southern rock, you're thinking of Allman Brothers, you're thinking of Lynyrd Skynyrd and things like that. We're just we're definitely into the forefront. But the thing was that, obviously there was just late 70s, you're thinking disco, you're thinking where there was a definite move for the next decade to change and real shake-up change. That's why punk was so strong in that. That's why you even heard where ska or breakbeat or just where you just were, I guess again, that's why they wanted to call it alternative sound. It just started to make a change. It was interesting how it happened over here. Now, Wikipedia, which take with a grain of salt, they're just the entry they put out for the section called The Music of Athens, Georgia. They say, quote, the contributions of Athens to rock, country music, and bluegrass have earned it the nickname the Liverpool of the South, and the city is known as one of the American birthplaces for both modern alternative rock and new wave music. When you look at Athens, Grace, and its contribution to the annals of music history, why do you think it was able to make such a big impact while being detached to any big city record labels?
Well, I think in part that was why it made a big impact. It was the right time for an isolated place. The revolt against the big music industry, the corporate music industry, really carried across what we sometimes talk about as a kind of revolt against disco or the pushback against stadium rock. I think more than particular genres, there was a kind of revolt against the idea that corporations were creating or managing or controlling what music we get to hear. And sometimes I think people forget that the 70s, late 70s and 80s was a very anti-corporate time for a lot of youth cultures, especially rebelling, during the Reagan era against the kind of rise of the yuppie and the idea that greed is good. There's a real underground movement against that. And so there's a rebellion against the music industry. So not being a center of the music industry actually, paradoxically, in this particular moment is a plus. Whether it's earned or not, it suggests that the music coming out of a place is more authentic, more real. I mean, we can deconstruct that, but that's the kind of reigning idea at the time. New York folks, music critics in New York are hugely important in making Athens this music center, because they really embrace this idea that Athens is full of all of these, in some ways it's a kind of a stereotypical dumb idea, but these southern bumpkins that are just like inherently naturally creative and weird and exotic because they're, like some kind of strange gourd growing out of the ground down there, the red clay of Georgia, So there is almost that kind of idea, that kind of stereotypical idea with the music critics, but they're just interested in anything coming out of this place because it seems so exotic, so completely unexpected, unheralded, unimaginable, and that really plays to that helps Athens musicians to get some, to get noticed. They all managed to go to New York City and play pretty early in their careers because of this kind of interest.
I'm a big radiophile, so my radio history is where I really look at when it comes to music. It's just, of course, it just comes together, and I just think about the early '80s, and I just think about the fact that the music got very, very soft to contemporary. The corporate rock had kind of really just blown people out a little bit. Too much sticks, too much Journey going on, and they just became the establishment. The establishment was just consultants and just really controlling the playlist. That free form of rock that you would hear, if it would have stayed around for the 80s, then you would have heard some of these bands from Athens come to the limelight much sooner across the country. But it is what it is. Now, AV Club, I want to take from a few different stories that had featured the book. So avclub.com reviewed the book, and they said, quote, that you make the case that without the small southern college town, there would be no grungy Seattle, no hipster Williamsburg, no weird Austin. While punk, metal, and new wave music was finding audiences bucking against the disco and stadium rock coming from the mainstream. Talk to me about the niche that the bands in Athens were able to look to carve, and were they any way parallel to what was going on around the country? Because, again, at this time, you were saying it again, it's a resistance to this corporate establishment of what was being put out in mainstream music. We wanted something different. We went to the underground, and in the lab, something was being built and created that would become the music of the next decade.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It absolutely has connections to the kind of punk and post-punk revolt going on in New York, and also to a certain degree in LA and Southern California and a few other big cities in America. I think the revolt against disco gets overplayed. I don't know how you feel about that down in Miami. I know you guys like to dance. I think that, there's some interesting like radio disc jockey, stunts about hating disco and all that. But certainly there is a revolt against kind of overproduced, or what is imagined as overproduced, over mechanical, too corporate, too big business music, whatever the sound. I will say in Athens, people love to dance. The gay kind of queer influence on the scene meant that you had to have a dance beat. So there wasn't really that anti-disco thing as much, but absolutely that anti-stadium rock. And really it's shaped against Southern, as you mentioned, against Southern rock, which is, what you're going to be hearing on a lot of radio stations across the Southeast at that time. Macon is not that far from Athens. It's the center of Southern rock. So there was a revolt against that. You do not hear any wanking guitars in Athens music until a decade or plus into it, before anyone will venture to do what I call at least a kind of wanking guitar solo. That is just not acceptable, right? That is, so there is this vision of all of these, in all these places, of creating a kind of authentic, raw, amateur music, and this idea that amateurs can be real, that they can be raw, that this can give us back a kind of authentic feeling and sound in our music. Sometimes, frankly, that just means the music sounds rough and ragged, and the musicians maybe could practice a little, or the recording could be done better. So when you listen to it now, sometimes you can kind of push back against that sort of understanding that amateur always means better. But in this time period, there is that kind of sense that this is where authenticity lies. I mean, what makes Athens so important, and why I think the AV Club pulled out that, made that, argument about what, that this is the ground zero, is Athens is the place that proves that you can do it anywhere. I mean, if punk says you only have to know 3 chords to create your own band, maybe not even that. Athens says you can know those 3 chords, and you can just sit down wherever you are with your friends and your housemates and make that music. You do not have to go to New York City. You do not have to go to LA. In fact, you will be more authentic, more real if you stay where you are, if you mine your local resources. Now we live in this time where everybody loves local food and local art, but that was not a thing in the 70s and 80s.
No.
There wasn't even a concept of that. Local meant bad. That wasn't the concept. And so Athens is a really key site in what we might call this kind of revolution of thinking of local particularity or regional particularity as something that actually is valuable, that you need to actually mine that, dig into that. That is the source of authentic artistic production, whether it's music or some other medium.
Just to unpack from before, anything that corporate touches is just, for me, I'm just a bit of like the nonconformist, where I just feel like disco had its time, and I think there was a lot in that scene that actually really offered a lot when it came to minorities or LGBTQ. That there was just a lot that was there that could be said about the freedom and the things were brought from that. So I always respect the scene, but again, it's the same way I would respect the scene like Athens. Again, but anything that has a corporate approach, and when that in the late 70s, 78, 79. When it just died, it needed to. It needed to do something, because I think corporate wanted to just go ahead and cram in so much because they felt like this has a short shelf life. We're just going to flood the market, and they did, and they destroyed it. It's their fault. They get out of touch. People from big cities is what happens. But when it comes to Athens, it was like when I went to college. It's college radio. It's like it's college campus rock, but you're getting great turnout at bars, clubs, concerts for the music's going on. It's just a good, new, fresh sound. And it was something to be necessary. So I can love where that started coming from, and it was different. It was just, it was you couldn't expect it to be done in a big corporate like an RCA Records or, Capitol or something like that. You just can't get that kind of thing here. So the A&R people, they should learn. They need to just learn, hey, you know what? There's something good going on in Athens. That's probably what it was word of mouth that made people learn about Athens. But for me, I always respect those indie artists and the record labels that are on right now that just can't. There's still good music right now in the underground. Rock is in the mainstream dead, and it saddens me today. It's been like that for a long time. I'll ask about that in a little bit, but moving along, I want to go now talk about University of Georgia. When they talked to you about this, they're a school newspaper, the Red and Black. You spoke with them about the book, and you told them, quote, "What happened in Athens, quote, began to develop as hipster places in other parts of the South, places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Columbia, South Carolina, also college towns, I might add. Different kinds of music clubs and restaurants, and the general cultural landscape of the music scene didn't exist before Athens. Athens inspired these places, and a really important part of this story is REM. REM was actually the first band to play in all these places. I thought it was funny. The first time they got together as a band, they played at a birthday party. It was the first time they performed in 1980. And they would play anywhere and everywhere. And everywhere they went, people wanted to find out about this place called Athens and where REM came from. And, REM was just starting to make its, making its name. The mainstream was not going to see them for a while. B-52's might have gotten an album that was, or a song like a Rock Lobster in 1982 that became a mild hit and still is it's like a cult hit today. But again, just some of the rumblings of Athens being looked at as a place to go listen for new music, where new music and new artists were coming in. And that's what you made a point across. Now, one other thing I want to make mention of, first part, talk to me about how you mentioned how this did spread into other areas in the South.
Yeah. Well, something that you picked up on earlier and I really didn't address, and that's part of the answer to this. I would say, two things that are going on with the spread here. One are the touring bands, and two is college radio. And you alluded to this earlier, but the college radio is where the DJs can play anything.
Yep.
Even college radio over time, by the late 80s and early 90s, becomes a little bit more routinized, a little bit more organized, or you might use that dreaded word, professionalized,
right.
Less creative. But especially in the late 70s through the mid 80s in Athens and other major college radio stations, DJs have a lot of freedom to play what they want, and in Athens they pretty quickly develop local music shows. DJs pull in local music even into their other playlists, and because UOG is considered to be even before Athens music, for some reason it's a pretty well organized, well run music station. Other college radio stations look at their playlists, and so that helps spread. That helps spread Athens music because they copy from each other. They share their playlists with each other, what's in heavy rotation. But the other thing is, besides college radio, is touring bands. It's live bands touring. Yeah, they might have a little single along with them, or later on a kind of rickety cassette. but that they're selling at the show or in local music shops, which of course still exist at that time, all the local music shops. And you can buy singles from bands all over the country you've never heard of for, $1 or $2. But mostly it's the live show. It's the touring. And REM is absolutely crucial here because they're not the first Athens band by a long stretch. Right. There are many others before them, but the other bands, we'll just talk about B-52s and Pylon. Some people laugh and say they're commuting to New York. They'll play Athens, and then they might play Atlanta. Maybe they'll play D.C., but the main place they play besides Athens is New York City in the early days, in the late 70s. REM comes along. These guys will play anywhere, and they do. It's part of the REM myth, but I researched it. It is actually true. They will play hot dog stands. They will play pizza parlors. They will play, this is a thing in this period, so REM's not the only band to do this, but in a lot of parts of the country, the only place that would book a band like this are the gay clubs that'll have a new wave night. Mm-hmm. And then they'll book some live music. And so REM will play these clubs. Now, to be fair to the other bands, all the other Athens bands have folks that are queer, gay, gender nonconforming. You don't want to be driving around rural Georgia and Alabama. I mean, there is rampant homophobia at this time. So to be fair, there are real important reasons why some of these bands did not want to tour just any place out there. People were fearful. Michael Stipe is now very much out as gay, but then was not. And, certainly his public presentation of himself, there are stories of him, and he was actually, he did get mugged once in Athens. People called him a fag and beat him up. So I don't want to diminish that. I think people forget that the favorite insult that replaced the N-word in a lot of parts of the country, at least for a certain segment of young, white, tough kind of kids, was faggot, right? That was the replacement. So there were real reasons people didn't want to tour. But the REM guys, they went everywhere. They slept in their van. If you invited them to your house, they would eat all your food without asking you. And they had no money, right? But they just had this romance of the guys in the beat up van on the road. Pete Buck had read a lot of Kerouac, and they just got out there and they went everywhere, and they really spread the word of Athens and the idea that you could do this wherever you are. You can make your own scene. And bizarrely enough, in a lot of these small towns and college towns around the Southeast and Midwest, some of these first, what we might later call alternative bands, start out as REM cover bands.
Yeah, and you know what? Interesting. Brings up my next point. People would then try to copy them. People wanted to start their own bands, create their own communities like Athens. REM was not only spreading their music, but they were spreading the word about what they would call later alternative culture. And it was a term that didn't even exist when they started doing it. Alternative came to identify new rock from the late 80s to the mid 2000s. And now alternative no longer has that definition. They still use that term, but it means nothing. And my thing is now is that, I've talked to a number of radio people and a lot of people in music about what happened to that music because it's now all digital. It's just unfortunate. You're not going to hear the things that have like a recording session of a Muscle Shoals, Alabama, or something where you just have this raw instrumental sound. It's not there. My thing is, what do you think is what happened to music and where that music is being played is instrumental? I feel like it's only in Nashville now.
Yeah. I think it's a real shame. I mean, some of it is the proliferation of inexpensive technology. And so people can produce a very produced sound in their own, literally garage or home, whereas, in the old days, a garage band was a garage band because it sounded, if you recorded it, it sounded like crappy recording because it was. I mean, Pylon's first demo tapes were made on a cassette player on Kmart brand tapes, and they sound like it. You know, so the technology allows us really cheaply to make very produced, very slick recordings anywhere. So I think that is part of it. I guess the question for me arises: why don't more people want to do something different? And I would bet they're out there. I'm just of the generation that I don't know where they are
Right.
I'm too old to know. But I think that there are young folks out there making raw sounding, less produced sounding music. Again, the internet is a blessing. The technology is a blessing and a curse. The internet means that you can circulate your music very easily. The question is, who's your audience, right? Who's going to find it?
I think where your audience,
going to hear it?
I'll tell you where your audience is now. It's TikTok. I mean, for me, it's amazing what kind of influence TikTok has now. And when I've heard some of the rare recordings that have come up that have been brought back to life, and all of a sudden, Fleetwood Mac and Dreams is now a hit again. It's number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. And number one song on the Billboard 200. What happened here? Yeah. There is room for this kind of music again. I mean, Fleetwood Mac's that's a super group, one thing. But again, rock guitar bass sound. Like, okay, there is an audience for that. The younger audience can come back and embrace that music again. They don't have to hear some kind of a trap bass sound out of an 808 or some other computer bass sound. They will want to hear instrumental. I think that kind of music can come back, but it's being held back by the mainstream. It has to be a grassroots movement once again, like Athens, to bring that back again. So you talked to University of Virginia, where we're at now. You're the Arts magazine there, and I want to take us into a positive note as we wrap up the interview. They wrote possibility. It's an idea that keeps coming up on the pages of Hale's book. You told them, quote, Athens also gave me a way to think about the history of possibility. It's not hard to understand why people fail when they try to make a better world. I wanted to ask a different question. What makes people try? The way music has gotten so digital and so homogenized in many respects, do you feel like there is a time now for more possibility, Grace?
I really do. But, I think that we're in a really tough moment. I mean, when are we going to be able to congregate together in crowded, dirty clubs that don't smell good, where the air conditioning isn't working and we're breaking the fire code? There's something about that impulse among young people to crowd together, and so much creativity comes out of that. And I think you see that on TikTok, lots of, at least early on, now of course it too is being professionalized, but a lot of amateur, creativity really, really on display on places in social media like TikTok. But I really feel like we need that in-person audience to come back, because that is where you actually meet other producers, other creators in ways that are unexpected. I mean, yes, you can meet them through the internet, but it's not by chance. You can't catch something that you weren't looking for. It's harder to have the unexpected encounter or the encounter with something that you might have thought you hated, but now you hear something in it. Maybe it's, again, just because I'm older, but I feel like part of the revolution is going to be the underground coming back in a face-to-face way. And we were seeing this before the pandemic in the kind of house culture, house party culture that is really, really vibrant in cities like Richmond, Virginia, and other places, often, again, linked to college campuses, young people who don't have money, or with clubs. There's not a professional club infrastructure, but there wasn't in Athens either in the beginning. House parties were key. And that was really, really thriving in a lot of locations before the pandemic. And hopefully that will come back.
I think what's going to happen with this pandemic, a lot of entertainment has been shuttered. And I'm looking about, I got another interview coming up that I'm going to be recording when it comes to what's going on in New York in terms of Broadway being shut down, foreseeable future, at least until summer of 2021 or even more after that. Same thing with movies, just the entertainment that we have. I think if there is a time where it feels like, politics are really in our face, which is always that way, music was always the one factor that if you wanted to break away and escape what was going on and really vent and really just feel all this raw energy and put it into something, music was that. And you can't do that with machines. You could do that with instruments. You could do that with on stage performance. I think we're going to get the idea of speakeasies again. I think there are going to be, like you said, these house parties. I think there's going to be this underground movement that's going to come from this, and out of the masses, it's going to just go ahead and bring us. There will be an opening of a crossover again, which is what we had in the 80s and 90s of different music that was coming out that we could appreciate. And I think that crossover needs to come back into music again, where it makes it into the charts. It makes it into where people could go ahead and find it once again. And there's a rumbling. There's an interest. Okay, this underground movement grows from it, and then it starts up, and then people start attaching themselves again. I feel like this can come from it. I guess the only thing I think is that, are there any groups? I mean, would like an REM, would there be groups like that when they're looking at the Athens music scene now, before the pandemic, it was still somewhat thriving. There was a lot of music going on now. Is there any kind of mentorship going on, or anything that can be done in order to just, get some kind of either music capital or something to just help, foster and mentor some of these groups so they can make it to somewhere again? If they can make it into a record label and get a deal and get the chance to be noticed, and then start a new movement of this music.
Yeah, you see that happening in Athens today. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bands. There's an old friend of mine who still lives there and runs a recording studio and the music business program at UGA too now, and his name's David Garvey. And he says there's over 500 bands there at any given moment. And they are absolutely mentored by older musicians who've been around forever. One big problem in Athens, though, is there have been various local labels that have been established, but none of them have ever really kind of hit that little bit of a level where you're local, but you've got sort of a little bit of a widespread, nationally sort of known, but locally based. It doesn't seem like the music labels that have been started in Athens over the years have ever hit that kind of sweet spot. Athens bands used to, in fact, be much more frequently on Atlanta labels like DB Records. But so there is a need for that. There's a need for that kind of recording, a record label. But that works in a totally different way now, right? I mean, the way record labels work. But just before we run out of time, I want to put a shout out for Pylon, a group that is releasing all of their catalog is being re-released on New West Records, both individually and in a really fancy, beautiful box set with a book. And I think TikTok really needs Pylon. So all you TikTok video makers out there, I think, put Fleetwood Mac aside and start using Pylon.
No, I agree. But I'll say this too, and this is just for me. In other countries like the UK or Canada, they have actually government programs where they have things where they can where the public interest will help to try to get this kind of music together. NPR, I want to outcry to them. Put a music show on or a music podcast on that offers room. You did Austin City Limits for many years. Why can't you do something for Athens? Why can't we do that for music again? That's what I work. That's where I want to come from with things.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, take the idea of the Tiny Desk concert and let's go bigger with that. Let's have much more of that kind of musical programming coming from NPR, from public, state level public radio stations and television stations. All of those things could program more of this kind of music, and hopefully they will in the future.
Exactly. There we go. We'll leave it there. Now, real quickly, you're going to be at the 38th Annual Miami Book Fair International, which is going to be held virtually November 15th to the 22nd. Website is miamibookfaironline.com. Tell our listeners when we can see you.
I don't actually know.
So the schedule's coming up and you'll find out pretty soon.
Yes, I apologize. The materials
it's okay.
Pre-recorded, and there's going to be some live Q&As, but they have not let me know the schedule. So
no problem. And I also see your website. You have it. Is your full name GraceElizabethHale.com. And also, where can people go and follow you on social media?
I am on Twitter only. I'm not much of a social media person, I have to say. Facebook is evil. But
I agree.
Hale on Twitter if you want to follow me.
All right, fantastic. Again, I've been joined by Grace Elizabeth Hale. Again, she is Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia and author of Cool Town, How Athens, Georgia Launched Alternative Music and Changed American Culture. Go find the book. Grab yourself a copy today. Grace, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Next week, I'll be continuing my interview, 2 parts, with Mwinza Kasire. You might remember we had him on last week, and I gave a little bit of a taste of what we're going to be talking about. Before I got into the interview itself, it was more or less kind of like just a pre-interview. We had such a good conversation going to start off. I wanted to start there and then move along into where the real interview starts. And that's about another hour or so of the interview that's going to present to you. And I will be bringing that to you next week here on the program. So thank you for the delay, for being patient during the delay of the program by one day, and patience for the Mwenza Kasiri interview, which I will bring in its entirety. Part 2 of it next week, and part 3 the following week after. So until then, remember, content is king, and the control of your content is in your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast, presented by BroadcastersPodcast.com and KingofPodcasts.com. The Broadcasters Podcast is brought to you by KingofPodcasts.com/Amazon. If Amazon is good enough for the King of Podcasts, it most certainly is good for you. KingofPodcasts.com/Amazon. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program. The Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at KingofPodcasts.com.